energy system planning, adequacy, security, affordability, economic vitality, those pieces of statute that are not drivers for the in the Global Warming Solutions Act for the Climate Action Plan in the same way they are for the energy plan. And then finally, we'll talk about the standards for more local planning that come from Act 174. Overall, we incorporated two major themes this time through the plan. The first one is equity and just transitions. And really how we did that is the core recommendation coming out of there is to elevate equity as a core criteria along with those state energy policy criteria that I put forth before, and have it not only just kind of as this thing we do on the side, but really embedded within each sectoral chapter that we have on thermal and transportation, on electricity. Wanted to make sure equity and the principles associated with equity are incorporated throughout. And we based that, did a lot of on a lot of the work of the Climate Council and the Just Transitions Committee, filtered through and into the energy plan. And the other major theme was grid evolution. No matter how we modeled it, electrification was going to happen and the impacts of the grid. Ann will talk a little bit more about grid evolution and that theme. As you look at the plan, there's a ton of background on the current status of the energy supply in each sector. And we won't go into detail here just for purposes of time, but there's a lot of slides at the end of this deck that are pulled out of the plan and could be used by you all as kind of a quick reference. And we can get into them if you want to, either tonight or another time. So what does the plan say? Well, first, it's designed to meet our greenhouse gas targets, requirements. But how will we do that with renewable energy? On the thermal and process, in the thermal and process sector, we set a goal to increase our renewable supply to 30% by 2025 and 70% by 2042. Doing that through reductions in energy demand, weatherization, with specific strategies, efficient buildings, and the state energy management program enhancements. And then it's also through considering and encouraging low carbon technologies and fuel choices, elevating different fuel choices for customers to make that economic choice to move to clean energy. Part of that is through consideration of the clean heat standard, through a study and then if reasonable authorization at the PUC. We could get into that. We'll kind of maybe leave that aside right now given recent events, and we need to let the dust settle and figure out next steps. But also through encouraging other fuels and technologies in other ways, like advanced wood heat, district heat, green hydrogen, and considering biofuels. On the transportation, in the transportation sector, the pathways are really vehicle electrification, including through incentives, and then infrastructure and policy, including rate design, load control. Again, part of the theme of grid evolution comes into play there. And then cleaner vehicles themselves, passing regulations to adopt California's advanced clean cars and clean trucks rules, and really continue to monitor biofuels developments, what other states in the region are doing requiring biofuels, and how that really impacts Vermont and where we can go from there. And then on the demand side of transportation, really looking at system efficiency for land use settlement patterns. These are really impact long-term goals, 2050 goals, as opposed to the 2025 goals, where we can integrate land use planning into our decision-making frameworks to support compact development, and then think about smart growth designation programs. And then again, increasing choices for consumers, making sure there's plenty of transportation options for public and active transit. On the electricity side, there's versions of this slide deck that have all kinds of charts, but I wanted to just cover this quickly. in meeting our greenhouse gas requirements, you can see that black line here on this chart. Like I said, electrification is a big part of that. If as modeled with certain technologies, electric vehicles and heat pumps, et cetera, one way to meet our greenhouse gas requirements will actually do more than double our energy demand over the course of the next 30 years or so. And so we really need to be cognizant of how we're planning for that and how we meet it with supply and how we manage our load. This chart also shows the supply resources in the electric sector, and you can see that we have more supply resources in this chart than load, and part of that is because of the need to curtail resources and the load shape associated with those resources, or generation shape. When that generation occurs might not be when the load is, so that we need to do we need to have more generation as modeled in this chart. What this doesn't show is that we didn't model resource management or load management. And again, we'll get to that in the grid evolution portion of this conversation, but so that there's a really big opportunity to help manage our load and evolve the grid going forward to reduce the amount of overgeneration we need here. So the recommendation for the broad electric sector is really to undertake a comprehensive review of our renewable energy standard design and complementary programs and options to meet 100% carbon free by 2032. That means looking at our current programs like net metering, standard offer program, but looking at them in a different way where we consider time and locational values, whether we want to get our resources from new generation or existing, and where we want to get them from, in state or out of state. Other areas of the energy plan, I just want to highlight that they're there. There's a chapter on energy finance that is really looks at financing options for customers to make investments. The energy plan also contains a state agency energy plan, our lead by example plan. There's modeling appendices. It also serves as our renewable energy standard report and as Act 174 enhanced energy planning standards, which I can turn it over to Ann now to start there and talk about there. And Ann, you can I can continue to move the slides if you like.
Great, that'd be great. Thanks, TJ. So next, please. So as folks you're very much aware, there are standards that were put out by the department back in after 2016 when Act 174 initially passed. Part of the statute at that time required that there was an update to those standards whenever we updated the comprehensive energy plan. So as part of our updating of the comprehensive energy plan that we went through over the year prior to when we just released it, we worked to gather input on how those standards should change, and also considered how to make the standards consistent with some of the new themes that we were exploring in the new comprehensive energy plan. So as you heard TJ say, that included equity, it included grid optimization, resilience is a theme that we wasn't technically a theme that we pulled out, but it was sort of imbued throughout the comprehensive energy plan and is a big area of discussion right now, the resilience of the grid and our energy supplies, et cetera. And also an increased emphasis on electric vehicles and all of the infrastructure that we may need to accommodate electrification and very large amounts of renewable energy resources or carbon-free resources. So we updated those standards for both the regions and the municipalities, and those standards are now on the department's website on our Act 174 page, so you can access them there. We're in the process of updating the tools that support planners in meeting the standards. So those include regional breakdowns of the LEAP modeling. We updated the LEAP modeling for both the climate action plan and the comprehensive energy plan. And now we have a license that enables us to work with that model and help create these regionalized LEAP scenarios. We're also working on, and Lou will discuss a little bit later, updates to the generation scenarios planning tool. That's where you're thinking about, how much of any particular renewable resource, such as solar or wind, et cetera, you might want to be planning for based on the availability of that resource in your region, environmental constraints. And now we're looking to layer on transmission and distribution level constraints, which I'm sure you're all going to be very interested in as part of your planning work. So hopefully this tool will help give you a little bit of extra support in that area. And then obviously we have a number of guidance documents that help planners to understand how to meet the various standards and ways they could demonstrate compliance. So we're in the middle of updating all of those. They're going to roll out over the next few months here, and we'll keep you updated on that. Next, please. Just leaning in a little bit more on the theme of grid evolution. I encourage you, if you really, really want to go deep, to pick up the Comprehensive Energy Plan or pull it from our website and take a look at that chapter. This is a very small number of words here, but we chose them all very carefully. We're looking to maintain, the security of our energy supplies. We want to make sure that they're resilient. We want to make sure that they're clean. But we also need to make sure that we're not creating sort of a superhighway when we really could have a grid that's optimized for all of our resources if we can just plan for them to be dispatched or to be used at the appropriate time. So just as an example, if we're talking about electrification, we are looking at a high number of electric vehicles and a high number of cold climate heat pumps. These are all loads that are going to add on to kind of our baseline load at different times of day. And if we're strategic about it, we can make sure that the times of day that those loads are added are either coincident with when we have high amounts of renewable generation on the system, or are not overloading certain parts of the transmission or distribution system, thereby necessitating very expensive build outs of those poles and wires that we would need to maintain. Ratepayers pay for all those costs. So we want to make sure that we're optimizing the grid we have before we add additional grid infrastructure. The same, if you think about, again, the highway analogy, all that load trying to squeeze through at one time, well, think about generation is going the other way, trying to squeeze through all at one time. But we can also make sure by doing potentially locational and time-based rates for incentivizing that generation to be there when we need it, to be coincident with load. And also storage is a key piece to kind of buffer between generation and load and variable resources and kind of those intraday and interday variabilities in terms of the output of resources. Next, please. Just a little bit more on this. This was an analysis that was done for ISO New England, where obviously Vermont is part of a regional grid. Our utilities have contracts with resources out of state, or they're going to purchase energy or capacity via the region. So what we do matters to the region and vice versa. This analysis is a hypothetical look at 2050 if we've added in a whole bunch of electric vehicles and heat pumps. This is the extent to which those could add to our winter peak, and our grid is built to the peak. So we're going to build a much bigger, more expensive to build and maintain grid if we're not careful about making sure that those resources are not pushing up the grid needs as much as they might if we are not careful with time and location-based rates and usage. So by time and location-based rates, that could be, for instance, Green Mountain Power has electric vehicle chargers that they provide to customers who get an electric vehicle. The quid pro quo there is that they can manage the charging, so not everyone is plugging in and charging right at 6 p.m. You can program your vehicle to be charged by 8 in the morning, and they will turn on that charging later on in the evening for groups of those vehicles. So we're not experiencing that spike, but more of a smooth demand from all of that fleet of vehicles. Next, please. And then going in the other direction on the highway, you're all probably very well aware of these discussions around sort of the grid hosting capacity. There's constraints that can occur both at the level of the distribution system, distribution substations, for example, and at the level of the transmission system, when all of that resource that's cited at distribution sort of feeds up to the transmission system. So Lou was going to talk more about this, but he, was key to an analysis that was done for Velco as part of their long-range transmission plan that looked at, what if we continued deployment of solar and other resources according to historic deployment patterns, sort of what does that do to grid needs and costs versus what if we could optimize where those resources are cited based on the available capacity of the grid. So next, please, TJ. And that resulted in an analysis that was in the long-range transmission plan that you might want to reference that looked at sort of the hosting capacity by zone, which is not exactly equivalent to regional planning commission boundaries, but you can obviously sort of pick out where you are here. Where we might be able to host the most, in this case, solar. So in this analysis, it was looking at solar, and the output was that we have the most hosting capacity in southern Vermont for adding more solar without having to build more transmission. You guys are up in Northwest Vermont, so you're probably very, very interested in how much solar or other resources you might be able to host. So I think that might be a good segue over to Lou.
Sure, thanks, Anne. And I'll just add that the work we did, if you flip back, TJ, these are marked out by electrical zones, based on where the grid is, where the infrastructure is to get the best sense of how the system is performing. But we're also able to break it out by town and then reallocate up to the RPC level. So in the Velco long range plan, you'll find that there are values listed by RPC for available hosting capacity. And that's something that we'll use later on. Anne already mentioned the generation scenarios planning tool. So we're making use of that data. So you see, obviously, that the top of the state is pretty red in comparison to the south of the state. It's pretty green, and I think we all know that's the result of the SHI. And on the next slide, we have the Sheffield Highgate export interface marked out. I think you'll all be, have heard of this once or twice before. Maybe some background information on this as to why it exists and what the real dynamic behind it is could be useful. And really, it's that
I think just so you know, there's probably a mix of people in the meeting, some who have heard about this a lot, and some for whom this might be a new situation they're learning about.
Sure. So yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we'll go through the whole story here. And so the first thing to know is that there's a lot more generation than load in northern Vermont. And I think that's pretty apparent if you're just driving through. You see solar panels and not as many houses as elsewhere in the state. And the result is that the transmission system is not suited to accommodate all the generation that exists there. Remembering that the purpose of transmission as established in the region and beyond that is reliability to load. It's intended to serve load. And so it was sized to serve the amount of load that exists. And that's between 20 and 60 megawatts, depending on the time of year, time of day in northern Vermont. And so with about 400 megawatts of generation at its max, at nameplate, it just far exceeds the amount of capacity that the transmission system can actually export. And now this wouldn't necessarily be a problem with all of the lines that you see on the map there. But system operators like ISO New England have to take into account a contingency, something that could go wrong in the system. And if you lose a transmission line, your ability to export power from northern Vermont, from this export constrained zone, is now limited. So when you lose the K39 line that's down in the bottom right-hand side of that red triangle circle thing, when you lose that line, the power has to flow all the way back to the eastern side of the state It can flow on the blue B20 marked there. That's a sub-transmission line, but not as much power can flow on it as on the black transmission lines. So you have to ship the power all the way back around to the western side of the state. When you're shipping that much power across such a long distance, you can think back to high school physics, circuits 101. You have a voltage source at one side and a sink at the other and a resistance in the middle. You have a voltage drop. And so what happens is that you end up with a low voltage. In this case, it happens to be at Highgate in the top left of the circle. And that leads to a situation that's not acceptable from a system operation perspective. And those are established to prevent the kinds of blackouts that we've seen in the past from large scale events. So ISO New England has to take action before the event happens, before the K39 line trips out of service or a different line trips out of service. ISO New England has to prevent any issues from occurring, and they do that by limiting the amount of generation that's online in normal conditions. And they do that to establish system reliability and to prevent blackouts. So we can flip to the next slide, TJ. Thank you. So we I mentioned the curtailments just then, and that leads to costs. You have a renewable generator with a marginal cost of generation of $0. It costs nothing next to nothing to run a wind turbine relative to other generators. And because our utilities in Vermont are vertically integrated, they own or have ownership stakes or contracts directly with the wind plants that are primarily curtailed. Kingdom Community Wind is usually hit first, Sheffield Wind sometimes. And between those two plants, about 100 megawatts of wind, they can be curtailed, 5 megawatts or 50 megawatts. And it can vary depending on system conditions. So that can lead to a lot of financial burden on the utilities, which they then have to pass on to ratepayers. And that's not to mention the renewable energy credits or the tax credits that they can get from producing power from those plants. It also leads to congestion, which effectively is like a local form of supply and demand for generation. Because all generators want to be running, they're willing to accept some reduced costs to keep running. And when there's too much generation in a single area, effectively the value of that generation decreases because everybody wants to be generating. And so that's termed as congestion in the ISO New England market structure, and it suppresses the price that is paid to generators. And that can have impacts across any generator in the area, not just the ones that's being curtailed. It can lead to an interesting scenario where if a municipality, let's say, didn't own generation but owned load, well, now they have to pay less for the generation that they're trying to obtain. So it can lead to some differing incentives in different areas. It's not a very common issue, but it does exist. By and large, the amount of pain that's inflicted on the utilities dominates the conversation just because of the numbers involved. And so there are some efforts underway to try to mitigate that. If we flip to the next slide, where the department worked with the utilities and Velco over a long period of time to try to figure out what are the ways that this could be mitigated from the financial front and from the infrastructure front. And so it was determined, the amount of curtailment that was taking place was quantified. Granted, history is not the future, but we can try to make some assumptions about what has happened and try to extrapolate into the future. And so it's possible to come up with a cost of additional generation if it were to have connected or if it were to connect in the future. And that cost can be assigned to new generators that want to connect, because every generator that's connecting is now taking up grid space, essentially. And so if there's a way to disincentivize generation that would be overly burdensome to ratepayers and the utilities, or to incentivize it to be smaller or in a different place, then that's the intent of the changes to the net metering rule that the PUC has put forward, that would have a mitigation fee for resources that would connect in a constrained area, like in the SHI. I mentioned that there are infrastructure efforts underway, and there are. The primary one of which is really the Lowell to Morrisville project. That's the big one right now. And that's a reconductoring of the B20 to B22 lines that GMP is working on. Now there's an interesting dynamic between thermal and voltage stability. And I think it's suffice to say that there's all of these projects that are being considered, additionally voltage stability projects at Sheldon Springs Hydro and at Sheffield Wind. All of these are working in tandem to try to increase the grid limits. Those will have, some positive impact in the amount of power that can be exported from Northern Vermont. Additionally, Velco is pursuing a rebuild of the K42 line, which maybe if you want to flip back to that map, TJ, we see the blue line, the B20, B22, that serves as an export path, and reconductoring that will help to improve the thermal and voltage performance of the system and raise the headroom essentially. And over on the top left, Velco's K42 line, which is very old and very lossy, will be replaced with newer infrastructure that will allow, some additional export. All of this is subject to further study by ISO New England. They're the ones responsible for the limit at the end of the day, and they have to ensure system reliability. They deputized Velco to do the study in the past, which I had the pleasure of doing, and I expect that they'll do that again. But everything has to be by ISO New England procedure. This is it's reliability is no trivial matter to ISO or to any of us really. So what does that mean? Flipping one more slide for the NRPC and where resources can or cannot connect without causing issues elsewhere. Now, it's not to say that you can't have any resources in a certain area just because of this, and that's the intent of the changes to the rules is to incentivize growth in certain places and to allow growth in those places as well, especially at smaller scales. And so what we see here is a map of what VEC has designated as within the SHEI in the darker red and potentially within the SHEI in the kind of pink color. And it's not quite delineated and for good reason that it's not quite clear always what will have an impact. On the next slide, there's another map of where the grid constraints are listed, and we see that in the southern part of what would have been connected to the SHEI, Bakersfield, Belvedere, Sheldon, Enosburg, Montgomery. These aren't necessarily constrained according to VEC, but they could be in the future, as well as some of the green areas. Right now, there's no problem in St. Albans, for example. If enough generation were connected there, the SHEI could expand to that area. It's hard to figure out what the exact quantities would be without doing a full study, but it's just good to be aware that none of this is set in stone, that all of this is flexible, and that just as additional generation could cause problems, additional DERs, distributed energy resources in a certain area, could help to alleviate problems. So with all that in mind, on the next slide, we have a snip from the generation scenarios planning tool. And this doesn't really take into account, transmission upgrades or non-transmission alternatives. But what it does do is it looks at, what we have in the system today and what generation could be on the system tomorrow. With all the great work that you folks do at the regional level for generation planning. And we want this tool to be able to assist in that effort by looking at what the available resources are for land and for the grid, based on what the targets are for energy and for megawatts installed. So these are some pretty rough numbers, and I think I've got something in the wrong place here, but I pulled some data from the NRPC 2017 energy plan, just to plug something in, and this will take further refinement. But this is something that we should be able to show. What is the output that's needed from generators in an RPC's area? How does that compare to the grid headroom? Right now we have pretty limited data for you folks in particular. We need to get some further data from VEC. So this will be based on GMP's data right now, as you can see on the right, where we look at distribution headroom as compared to the amount of generation that would be installed in an individual town. So the few yellow ones pop up as exceeding distribution capacity at a very rough level. This is not meant to be, you know, an engineering analysis, but kind of a high level. And then, as we saw earlier, we're still in the red transmission zone. You know, we haven't, I think, between the utilities and the department, we haven't quite figured out how to align the distribution and the transmission limits right now. You know, you saw earlier, they're in two different maps. There are two different numbers here. I think eventually we'll be able to figure out some way to integrate those and come up with, you know, something a little cleaner. But for now, you know, we have the transmission headroom that limits the amount of generation that can be connected. And so you see a big scary number up in the top right that, you know, we can take with a shaker of salt right now. Again, this being preliminary, but just to recognize that, you know, there would be, you know, large costs to far exceeding the available grid capacity, but that it's possible to, you know, find alternatives. You know, there's anything that the grid may be a constant, but that it can be changed, somewhat paradoxically. So with that, I think I'll stop and see if anyone has any questions for any of the three of us.
Well, that was a lot of information. Thank you, all three of you, for what you provided for us. It's great context as we're getting ready to work on our regional energy plan update in the coming months. Barclay, I saw you had your hand.
Yeah, well, looking at the situation in northern Vermont, and that so much of what you've got on your charts is solar, wouldn't large scale storage even things out so that less would be transmitted during the daytime, and that balance could be brought through, so it would be more even transmission without having to spend $500 million on new transmission lines?
Yeah, I would say certainly. I think the problem that we run into is just a matter of the available technology. Certainly cost is an issue, but really right now, lithium-ion batteries are predominantly the technology that's available. And by and large, those are best when they operate for a few hours, 3 or 4 hours. And that can be useful for, you know, trying to avoid peaks or trying to avoid troughs, you know, for absorbing solar during the day and putting it out onto the grid at night. The dynamic of the Shii is a little interesting because it's predominated by large hydro in the form of Hydro-Quebec power coming down from Highgate or connecting at Highgate, and wind power, which, you know, this is a point of a lot of discussion, you know, back a few years ago when all this started kicking off with the utilities. And the winds, you know, the wind can cause, you know, a lot of output for many hours, and the grid can be constrained for many hours. And in those long durations, the lithium-ion battery use case doesn't seem quite as strong. So we're still, you know, holding out hope for you know, a long-term storage solution to come through. All of those right now seem to be in their preliminary stages of development and cost reduction.
I have read recently that it looks like Europe is doing some very interesting stuff with gravity storage.
Yep, that's something we're keeping on our eye on for sure.
I have a few, but I'll just start with one and then see if we have time to come back around. But I'm a bit concerned, and thanks again for the presentations. They were great. As I look at what's needed for the next 100 years from an electricity perspective, as we go towards renewables, it reminds me of what happened with our highway system. And to me, it's the new highway system. It's the new United States infrastructure that needs to be put in place. And when that highway system was being put in place, all major cities thought they were putting in enough capacity, right? And they all now wish that they had put in more capacity than they needed, because it has become exponentially more expensive to put it in after the growth occurred around the highways than it would have been to do originally. And so I think that when we talk about building our electric highway so it can just handle smooth loads, we're making the same mistakes that we made with our interstate highway around all of our major cities in this country. Just a point and something I think we need to keep in mind as we move forward, that you know, we can't be too short-sighted. We need to be putting infrastructure in place that's going to last for generations, not for our generation. Along those same lines, I have a basic question. You know, as I look at the state plans, it seems to me that electric cars are a huge part of the plan and the ability for the plan to be successful. Are any thoughts from any of you on how I'm using quotes, the 10-minute charge rule will be brought to bear for it to be feasible for travelers and truckers and people who need to go beyond a tank full before they can sleep and let their car charge at home? Because I don't see a lot of work going into making sure we have the same level of infrastructure for charging vehicles in a short period of time that we have in terms of gasoline.
So I can give you some answer to that, although I'll note that our agency of transportation was the lead on the transportation sector of the plan. We incorporate all of our agencies in developing the plan, even though the department is the lead. But there is quite a bit of infrastructure investment going in. We have even just this year in the budget that was passed, over $30 million towards electric vehicle supply infrastructure. On top of that, there's other efforts by utilities. GMP, for example, is in their climate activities under their alternative regulation plan, looking for doing pilots on for make ready work and putting in when they're, to your earlier point, when they're making investments in infrastructure, making sure there's enough to actually supply fast charging stations at critical spots in the state, and then two, to kind of pilot different rates that will encourage those fast chargers to come. So working together with the state investments to kind of set up the rate structure and the investment structure to encourage kind of companies to come in and see the business case for actually siting some charging stations where people will need them. Right now in a lot of the state, there aren't enough electric vehicles to make that business case happen. So the state that's what a lot of that money is going towards, is actually investing in that public charging. The state, there's a agency of transportation has a plan, an infrastructure plan that they're working on, or actually there's an EV plan that I think has just come out, and then infrastructure plan along with it that is mapping out where they need fast chargers and how many they think they need and when. And
but the reality is if we're trying to get to 70%, right, don't we need at least as many fast chargers as we have gas pumps in the state?
Perhaps, really, do we need 8 gas stations in downtown Montpelier area that there is, when most people are can just go home and charge at home? Maybe not. It could just be more of a corridor type of have the fast chargers at the right spots. And how many of those goes beyond my expertise, I guess, but folks are thinking about that. But then also, to the point about our infrastructure, is that additional load and all the electrification that's coming on can actually help in where there's generation constraints in the northern part of the state that Lou and Ann were talking about, and then managing that appropriately can actually really reduce costs. So it's all tied together.
Thank you.
One of the things we commented on in our comments on the comprehensive energy plan is that incentives that increase demand on electricity should be focused in areas where we have these constraints to help with that issue, by targeting our investments in that way. Just remind folks that we did submit that comment from the Regional Planning Commission through the plan process. I have Matthew and then Peter with their hands up.
Yeah, this is Matthew. I have an idea to possibly meet the demands, that we're looking for. Vermont's like a heart, Think how blood gets to a heart, There's arteries. Vermont has arteries called substations. How about, putting storage battery units or solar trackers paired with solar trackers at each of these substations, throughout Vermont? Have anybody had any ideas about, or any thoughts about, trying to go in that way to at least what you call temporary, have those methods in place? It's temporary until we actually get the grid upgraded. But has anybody thought about doing it that way to at least, reduce the demand on the loads that we are facing, or electric utilities are facing?
I would say yes. We regularly review utility integrated resource plans. These are their plans for the investments they're going to make and the resources they're going to procure on a 3-year looking forward basis, and looking out even 10 and 20 years sometimes. And right now, for example, Green Mountain Power has an open proceeding just looking at they filed at the end of 2021 integrated resource plan, and I don't think you can turn more than 2 or 3 pages before you see storage, and at different scales and in different locations. So in some cases it's Powerwall sized home backup batteries that you can then, the customer has it for home backup purposes, but also the utility can aggregate all of that to reduce when the system's peaking and save costs for all the customers. And then you scale that up to sort of the larger size systems, 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts, and they're already deploying quite a few of those. And there is discussion, if I recall correctly, about looking at trying to site those at substations. It's seemingly a good point to kind of buffer a lot of those, arteries, or if you will, sort of feeding into that substation. I think Lou and I have had some discussions about, are the substations, we talked about future proofing or make ready substations, maybe able to accommodate that storage, or maybe they would need quite a bit of work to be able to accommodate the storage. But as utilities are rebuilding substations, it's something they can kind of future proof or plan for. I don't know if Lou, you want to add anything about just whether it makes sense to site storage at substations beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, if you have a hub that's connected to different places, you can make the most use of a storage asset, where it's at that intersection. It's a great way of avoiding impacts that, you might see from the distribution system up to the transmission system. And so that's probably the place you would see that, kick in at the large scale. On the very small scale, you could see a lot more penetration of distributed storage, like the Tesla solar Powerwalls GMP program has been incentivizing that. So I think there are a lot of ways to do it, and it's not certain exactly how to make investments right now that will lead to the best outcomes. But these are it's certainly something to keep in mind as we learn more about what's needed.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, just a general observation. You've thrown a lot of data at us, which is going to be challenging to kind of assimilate in ways that will help us identify what exactly needs to be done in our regional plan. And it gets even more challenging from my perspective when so many issues relate to transmission, which is an incredibly complex area that involves stability, reliability, economics, and any number of other things. And having been involved in utility regulation for 30 plus years, I'm always sensitive to efforts that induce behavior that may not be nuanced enough or may results in overshooting the mark. There have been plenty of examples of that in the past. And when you have a situation as dynamic as this one, I'm hopeful that we will get guidance that will permit us to move in the directionally appropriately, but do so in a way that does not, start creating movements that are tough to slow down after the fact.
I guess my only kind of, I totally am with you, and it's very, it's challenging for us to, we can have our planning team calls and really, talk about how all these interactions, and then, we'll go to try to talk about them with the legislature, and it's, that's a different area of concern, or, maybe not talking about the full picture. So it's very challenging. And I think just having this iterative discussion and, knowing that we're available to drop into a meeting like this if you're working through a thorny problem. But I just wanted to say that the iterative nature of these planning efforts is important. We, as much as we're saying, well, this is the comprehensive energy plan, and here's, the Velco long range transmission plan, and here's how you should, absorb it and into your plan. I think we're also hoping that your plan will help inform, the statewide planning, because it's not a fixed picture. There could be a breakthrough in long range storage that gets cited, and we can get some R&D money, or maybe we can cite something that would really alleviate some of the SHI curtailments or constraints. And then you wouldn't want to necessarily have a plan that says, well, we're not going to do any more generation. We're not going to plan for any more generation because we have this constraint. The constraint can go away. ISO New England market rules sort of came in and made the constraint worse, right? Nobody was anticipating that necessarily. So hopefully you have some scenarios. I think we would encourage you to have, looking at, here's the situation as we see it for the next maybe 3 or 5 or 10 years. Obviously you'll do another plan every 8 years or more soon than that. But, you could have a scenario that says, if this constraint is alleviated, we might want to focus more on generation and less on electrification or something like that. I think there's ways to keep your options open, I guess.
I agree. It's just that unlike past efforts, which have mainly been driven by economics, when you're getting to reliability issues, they're much more unforgiving when things aren't quite right. Much less forgiving. And so it's even more important to make sure that the efforts are done appropriately.
And I'll just chime in to say that throughout all of this, Velco and GMP and ISO New England and VEC and all the utilities are keeping reliability first and foremost. That's the first step to a sustainable grid, as a reliable one and a safe one. And that's something that they, that they carry first, and that we make sure that they carry first.
Kirk, you have your hand up again.
Sure. Interesting topic. So I would say in my last year on the regional planning project review, by far the largest number of projects we're reviewing are for renewable energy installations. And so and many of them are in the SHI area. It seems to me that it doesn't make sense that the state and we continue to endorse these projects in that area. So I guess I'm looking for some recommendations. Should we be pushing back and saying, look, the distribution doesn't exist. We're not, those developments should be done in a different part of the state.
Right, and the value of that renewable energy generation is different in the northern part of the state than it is in the southern part of the state. From a statewide basis, where I mentioned that the main recommendation in the electric sector was to really try and reconsider these statewide programs. And what happens is, in a little bit to Peter's point, is that we have these mechanisms that we say we want to encourage renewable energy, and on a statewide basis, we can't like pick and choose exactly where we want it for simplicity. And on a statewide program, we have one set of incentives, and it applies equally across the state. And then we find out the land is cheaper in a certain spot, and there's other mechanisms, and all the generation is locating in one spot. And so in part of that consideration, we're hoping to really better value based on location. And we started to do that in the interim with the grid adjustment fee, which, from a developer's perspective, say, hey, now I'm, $75 a kilowatt more encouraged to locate in the southern part of the state. But as you just said, that clearly isn't enough given the other incentives structures that are out there for in the state. And so we want to revisit that as it goes to your local planning. I think you could, potentially you could take that to another level if you wanted to, and really encourage even more of showing even more of an economic benefit to the area, if you will, or what other criteria you want to put on it within the confines of the guidelines to really help encourage that further. But it is, you're making the right point, and we're hoping to that we can make the case and draw in input like this to help make the case that we need to have a more nuanced approach to our incentives.
Yeah, I fear that, the majority of people are not well educated in these topics, right? So if the general population starts seeing articles in our local papers that we're rejecting renewable energy resources, it's going to be hard to then have people show up and think in a very positive way about how we're going to do this whole thing, right? Mm-hmm. Because clearly describing Shiite to them will not be easy. So I also struggle with the whole equity part. We talk about equity, but yet probably the lowest income area of our certainly region, if not state, is being told you can't participate in this renewable energy opportunity.
Yeah, that is another good point. And not only that, you can't participate, but you're still paying the cost.
Right. Right.
So great. That's a great point. I don't know if Ann, you had anything to add on how to pull that into the regional planning and how to help.
Yeah, I mean, the more obvious place that strikes me to make some headway or difference would be talking about different scales of projects. And I think we could help you work through some language there, but for instance, there's only going to be a certain amount of headroom. And if you have a very large project come in, one very large project, maybe it's not even, has a contract with, not even an entity in Vermont, so it's not necessarily benefiting Vermont ratepayers, that resource will eat up a lot of headroom. And you may not have as much left over for, your residential systems, your rooftop systems. So when I think about equity and the number of people that might be able to participate in something like net metering or another similar program, as well as, the grid impacts, the more you're keeping behind your meter and just serving your own load versus exporting to the grid and pushing out onto the distribution and transmission, sort of the less stress you're having on the system in the aggregate. So, you to the extent you talk about, the size of resources, as well as the location and, I guess preferences or siting in that regard, that strikes me as one way you could get at the siting tied to, grid impacts as well.
Thank you. Very, very interesting discussion that will take us many hours over the next several months.
I'm already looking forward to updating the regional plan based on this discussion. Peter, you have your hand up again.
Yeah, just one more thing. Because the impacts vary so much regionally, and because there's so much relating to reliability type issues, or at least some of them, it seems much more appropriate for the state through the department, Section 248 and so on, who have criteria precisely targeted to address these kinds of things, and will therefore be able to justify differences across the region, or across the state, excuse me, than for regional planning commissions to be taking a major lead in these things, when we're really more talking just about citing for other purposes, much more general. It's a heavy load for us to do compared to what the state can do.
I mean, at the end of the day, do we really approve projects, or we just give? We can approve or disapprove. That doesn't prevent it from happening, right? So.
Right. So with well, Ann could probably say this better than I can, but so with an approved plan, then you get substantial deference in commission proceedings, so that, you know, it's not a sure thing, but there's deference to your position. And I think the 248 process, which is the commission's citing process, is a place for where we do interject. There was it wasn't a moratorium per se, but you know, effectively for a little while, when a number of cases were stayed while the commission considered a grid adjustment fee and ways to kind of better encourage or discourage, as it may be, projects in the Shia area. The grid adjuster fee kind of tried to get at the economics of that, and that's one of the criteria, and one of the ones that we really look at under Section 248 is the economic benefit, and that was kind of agreed to, I guess, a negotiated number based on the expected impact, as Lou explained, to try and kind of balance out those impacts, and then again allow projects to actually be sited in the area. And so reliability again always comes first, but you know, if the project is, or a project is curtailed, but the, you know, the new project kind of essentially is paying for that curtailment, then ratepayers are a whole are maybe better off for having more renewable energy in the system.
I see, Matthew, you have your hand up again, and I just want to, before we wrap up with these folks, want to make sure Jim and Marlene and Molly, that you have any questions you want to go ahead and ask, or Barky, if you have another one. Go ahead, Matthew.
Okay, yeah, this is Matthew. While we're on the topic of, you know, infrastructure, networking is a big portion of that. You know, with the technology out there, upgrade technology out there, 5G technology. I know there's some state is hesitant, or the governor is hesitant, you know, with the, you know, the latest technology, because he doesn't know that what is this for, which I understand that. But with the technology infrastructure or networking within utilities, you know, a utility is only as good as you can make it unless you have upgraded networks. The only way they will be able to be more cost efficient or efficient in general is the networking piece aspect of it. Most of the technology is outdated. Most of it we're relying on trying to integrate technology that, you know, was like, you know, old news, you know, but you want to upgrade it to the new up-to-date technology that might be able to help with the workload of power transition. Because like I said, I think half of it is the state of Vermont's transmission lines are pretty like this itself as an aging demographic. They're old and they cost a lot to maintain. But with the technology we have advancement, there are work a way around these issues. about, maybe integrating, having, like I said, outside partnership, outside resources, people that know the technology, that what we need to make these systems more efficient is going forward is like, ask. We got to ask to be able to get the technology. And if we don't ask, we don't get it. It's just, we have to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just respond quickly. I think you're making a great point. The electric sector is quickly converging with telecommunications, right? And the need for broadband to facilitate kind of some of the services we're talking about, even in order for advanced metering and load controls to work. A lot of devices speak to each other and need that broadband service. And the state is making investments in that. It's not as fast as anybody would like, but there's now a Vermont broadband board, community broadband board, that is, has hundreds of millions of dollars to make investments in broadband, and we need to make sure we're coordinating that with and keeping up on the electric side with advanced metering infrastructure. There is some funding that just passed the budget for new and updating infrastructure, and making sure that we're coordinating that telecommunications and electric system kind of convergence to better offer services to customers that they need and want. So it's a really great point and great to keep in mind. And I'm not exactly sure how you do that in your regional plan here, but I think we could, hopefully work together to keep that front of mind.
Thanks. Marlena, I see you have your hand up. And just again, last invitation for Dan, Vincent, Molly, Jim, Ania. Okay. Marlena, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So we have kind of talked about the balance between like electrification and then renewable production. Is there any sort of modeling that compares, like, meeting our electrification goals versus meeting our renewable production goals? And, depending on how successful we are with electrification, obviously that will reduce the burden of, or allow us to produce more. And I'm just curious if there's any like more direct comparisons of the two.
So I think the modeling that was done that chart that I showed earlier on the electric sector showed kind of the new demand from all the electrification, and then new resources needed to meet that demand. And then
Is TJ just frozen for me?
they were, oh, shoot.
Oh, we got you back.
You're back.
Got me back. Okay. Sorry about that. My kids probably just all jumped on the internet. So one scenario that we did though is model, well, what if more of that electricity came from in-state resources rather than the regional resources that may be available. And we in that modeling mainly pertained to cost. We made some loose assumptions on what infrastructure upgrades might be necessary, but needs a whole lot more refinement. But there are, and that's all in the LEAP modeling that we did, the low emissions analysis platform tool, using that tool and for both the action plan and the energy plan. So there is some analysis available, and we're working to translate that into what it means for each region, as you know. But I'm not sure it will necessarily, we'll be able to adjust kind of in-state generation or in-region generation, I think, and play with that a little bit and see what the costs are. And they're kind of indicative results. I don't want to put too much focus on the modeling, but it's helpful to kind of sharpen the questions and say, oh, well, more in-state renewable energy generation looks like this, or in region looks like this. What does that mean for us now, and how do we plan for that? So so we do have some of that modeling, and hopefully it will be down to the regional level to be useful.
And just to
Anne
add,
asked, I'm sorry, Anne asked in the chat, just to clarify how out-of-state usage is incorporated into that, as in visitors.
So in the demand model, the out-of-state usage kind of tracks how it is now. So I think based on gas credit card receipts, we know that 25% of our fuel sales for transportation are from out-of-staters, and we assumed that would continue going forward. And so, and we have population change assumptions. You can, if you want to adjust, say that population is going to grow from climate refugees or for whatever other reason, you can adjust that as well. But there's, as far as in-state versus out-of-state customers or people coming here, I think it's projected based on historical trends.
Thanks, TJ. Lou, I didn't mean to cut you off, sorry.
No, sorry. Just to add a bit more on the grid capacity front, I think I mentioned that the transmission hosting capacity analysis with the heat map, the red, the green zones, that was done with present day transmission data and present day load data, present day generation data. If you're aware of GMP's solar map, and I think it was in one of the slides where they have all the feeders that they have, red or green or yellow based on available capacity. That's all done with today's data. It doesn't account for future projections in electrification. And I think the primary reason is that it's just hard. It requires additional analysis, which is certainly not infeasible, but it's hard to pick the right numbers of what is coming online, when and where and how much. So it's difficult to know exactly what kind of parameters to use in that kind of forward-looking hosting capacity. That's not to say that there wouldn't be additional hosting capacity, as you say, Marlena. There certainly would be, and trying to figure out how to align regional and state plans or targets or requirements with utility planning is something that we're actively engaged in, and if we can do a better job of trying to line those things up, then let us know your thoughts, and we're going to continue to try to press on that front as well.
Your offer is very timely since we're getting ready to update our plan. But we have kept you much longer than we initially anticipated, but that's because you had so much great information to share, and we had so many wonderful questions and comments from our committee members. And so I wanted to just thank you so much for all of the time the three of you took to be here with us tonight. It was really great.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you're welcome back
you all.
anytime. And probably we'll get specific invitations later.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome to stick around, but we also understand you probably want to get back to the rest of your evening, so we'll let you go and say thanks again.
Good night.
Thanks.
So we had originally planned on our agenda for this not to last so long, but really we had so many great questions. I didn't want to cut it off and cut it short. So what I would like to propose is that we set aside the presentation on the open meeting law to a future meeting, rather than having another technical presentation on a topic like that. We can hold it off to another meeting if that's amenable to everybody. I see some nodding heads. Great. And so we'll go ahead and pass over that agenda item.
Yeah, and Catherine, have you sent out the slides for open meeting law? Because for some of us, it's second nature because we've been living with it a long time. For others, it may not be. And maybe just reading the slides would help in the short term.
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Also, we can follow up from this meeting. We'll include the slide presentation from our Department of Public Service guests, as well as the presentation I was going to give tonight that we'll hold off to another night.
Great.
And so the next item we had on the agenda is Marlene is going to give you an update on a project she's working on with Swanton.
Yeah, and sorry, everyone, I've been having some computer issues. That's why I was out and I don't have my camera on. But so I attached a poster with the email I sent. And actually, there's a couple adjustments. So I'll send a new one. But basically on June 1st, we'll be hosting an EV ride or drive event. So this gets EV drivers from around the region to come and kind of open up their cars and have conversations with people. People get to come and look at them and ask questions and either ride in them or drive in them. And we do have some car dealers who have agreed to come and bring cars, and also people from utilities. So it's a really helpful way to kind of get all the information on the incentives that are available and to really talk to other Vermonters, because that has been, a lot of people are hesitant, like, how does it drive in the snow and how does it actually last going to Burlington, and all of these different things. So it's a really successful model. They had an event like this last year, and they sold 3 EVs immediately after, with people citing the event as kind of the catalyst. So it's a very exciting thing to get to host another one. I will send out the updated poster, and feel free to share that, or tell people that this is happening. Also attend if you are interested. Yeah, that's just a nice thing to kind of be able to offer our residents.
Thanks, Marlena. I'm actually excited about going to that. I'm one of these people who's had an electric lawnmower for the last 10 years, mostly because I couldn't stand the noise. And so I'm excited to eventually move on to the vehicle itself.
I know, right? And the technology updates so quickly. That's the other thing.
Yeah,
It just changes very quickly. So I have an EV and I never shut up about it. So I like that I get to talk about it somewhere that people actually hear it.
Wonderful. And we are in the final stages of getting ready to install a charging station, actually, at the Northwest Regional Planning Commission office that will be available to staff and visitors to the office. So when we get to the point where we meet in person again or do hybrid meetings, if you have an electric vehicle or a hybrid that you're bringing to the meeting, you'll be able to charge up while you chit chat through the meeting.
So Marlena, how long does it take to charge your vehicle fully?
So it depends. I charge mine just at level 1. So that's plugged into a completely normal outlet. And it charges in about, I don't know the exact hours, but I charge it overnight and that usually does the trick. And then there's a fast charger at Maple Fields, and that I usually plug in for like 10 minutes. And that gives me almost a full charge.
Wow.
And level 2, I think it's like 8 hours is the full charge, but I just plugged into a level 2 yesterday, and I went for like a 4-hour kind of jaunt around town, and it went from like 25% to full. So I've been very impressed with how quickly it charges. I thought that just plugging in at the normal 120 volt was going to be an issue, but it really hasn't. It charges overnight pretty easily.
Thank you.
I think the 10 minutes is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
It's so great. Yeah, it's just like charging your car or gassing your car.
But for it to work for interstate travel, that's what's going to be necessary, I think. So.
Yeah, the fast chargers are definitely crucial. That's something I've noticed, is like the level 1 and level 2 are great, but that's really like if you're going somewhere for a full day. That's kind of only if you are working somewhere or you're living somewhere. It doesn't make sense really when you're just out and about. I also think placing them in city centers, like places where there's fun things to do in walking distance so that you can plug in your car and then walk to something is really important. That's something I've noticed as a driver. I look for the stores that are close by and then I'll go to them. So sometimes when we put them at like rural park and rides where there's nothing around it, it's kind of a bummer because you just have to sit in your car. So, being mindful of where we place them is obviously helpful.
I was going to say, my son has a Tesla and he lives in Texas. And when he's driving, it tells him when he needs to get close, he's getting close to a charging station and when he needs to recharge his vehicle. So, and Tesla has these charging stations all over the place out there. I'm not sure about here, but they're like gas stations, but they're lines of charging stations. So it's pretty easy in a bigger metropolitan area like that. So he likes it, so it's good.
Yeah, Matthew.
Yes, I think the governor's trying to address that too as well, about making sure that these charger stations, the DC fast chargers are like within every 5 miles of the interstate or within every few miles, because he understands that most of the commute is interstate highway travels, and it just, we can improve on this throughout Vermont. I don't think the interstate is just, the only area where these fast chargers should be at. I think they should be at the multiple level and the town level too as well, because like I said, having it just, isolate to just for near interstate, it's okay, it's good, but when you really need it, it needs to be like somewhere like in town, and like you said, and like multiple power pins, around the state and these rural towns that need it the most, because most of these, travels like through Grand Isle County, we got a lot of truckers and probably a lot of foot traffic from Quebec and New York that may want to be, enticed to use these charging stations. It just, we need more availability and flexibility and accessibility to access these chargers for everyone.
Right, and also we need to think about making sure charging is available to people who don't live in single family homes. Right, those who live in apartment buildings or multi-family buildings where you're not necessarily pulling into a garage or a driveway with your extension cord, and making sure that that's available to everyone. Great. I don't have any other agenda items we need to do tonight then, except to ask Marlena to remind us when the next meeting is.
That's a great question. Let me double check. So it will be June 15th.
Great.
6:30.
You're still playing with the time, the
Yeah.
start time. We've had, just like trying to find a day of the month to have the meeting, we have mixed answers on the start time, and there's no real clear winner. So we're still playing around with that, but we'll be in touch about it.
Yes. Yep. And these first couple meetings are obviously very dense with information, but I appreciate everyone kind of sticking in and sticking through. Yeah.
Great. So we'll follow up with the presentation slides from Department of Public Service, that updated poster from the EV Drive event, and the open meeting law presentation. Great. Well, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will see you all very soon.
Have a great night, everybody.
Evening. Thank you.